Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the Victorian Queen they tried to erase from history. Forget the tiaras, forget the Disney music. This is no fairy tale. Quick one before we dive all the way in. I want you to ask yourself this sharp questions while we light this candle. Who gets to write history and who gets erased? What would you do if staying in power meant stepping over people you once loved? When does a leader stop being a protector and start being a predator? Stick with me through this story not just for the chills, but because by the end, you'll learn a lot about how people move when power's on the line. You'll also pick up little survival tricks for handling humans, spotting the fake smile, reading the silence between words, and knowing when to bow and when to run. Sound dramatic? Good. That's the point. Now dim the lights, grab a snack, maybe even a blanket, because we're going to need comfort for this one. The Queen. Nobody wants to remember. You open a battered scrapbook. The leather is stiff and warm from someone else's hands. Rain patters against the window like fingers drumming a morbid rhythm. The first thing you notice is a headline someone has literally tried to remove a penknife swipe, hurried and angry. 2 words remain. The Queen. And then a drunken black smear, as if the writer ran out of courage and decided to erase what they'd written. Pause. Listen. There's a sound like someone scraping dried blood from a knife. That scraping is history being rewritten. You flip the page. There's a portrait tucked inside oil on canvas, long since darkened by candle smoke. She's wearing pearls and a silk dress the color of old milk. Her hands are folded politely. Her eyes stare like someone who has memorized the sound of every secret in the room. The artist tried to soften her jaw. The sitter wouldn't allow it. On the bottom of the frame, someone has penciled a short line and then tried to cut the pencil out. She came as mercy, she stayed as weather. Riddles, contradictions, that's our story. She's been edited out. We're putting her back. You lean closer. Ink flakes off another clipping. A foreign paper calling her the madwoman of the palace. A pilgrim's journal praising her courage. A courier's note that simply reads, "Do not let her funeral be public." The pieces don't fit because somebody threw half the puzzle away. Now the sensory stuff, because this is how you live a moment in someone else's skin. Smell, coal, damp wool, a faint scrap of rosewater gone sour. Underneath it, a metallic whisper, the coppery scent of old money and older blood. Sound, boots on flagstone, a lullaby being sung in the kitchens. The distant clatter of a carriage that never stops. Behind that, low murmurs like a prayer that's really an accusation. Touch. The page is rough where someone folded it to hide a sentence. Your fingers pick up an oily residue, maybe candle wax, maybe something they didn't want you to notice. Let's pause for a moment of dark humor. Imagine the tabloids back then. Someone handwriting Mad Queen with a flourish and a quill. You can almost see the headline artist crossing a T with a theatrical flick. But there's more than gossip here. Look at the margins of the state ledger. Items crossed out in a different hand. A doctor's bill annotated with the word seizure, and, in a separate column, silence. Men who passed judgments suddenly fell ill. Delegates who opposed her policies were reassigned to distant colonies with suspiciously short letters home. Which brings us to the first real fracture in her rule. She began as a diplomatic, charming consort, someone who knew how to laugh at the right moment and sign the right papers. She brought bakers from other courts. She invited foreign engineers. She let new books into the palace library. For a time, people said she had the best taste in porcelain in 3 counties, the kind of queen you'd follow into a ballroom. And then, the tide changed. A shipment of printed pamphlets arrived with criticism, and by the time the courier left, the pamphlets had all been burned. A priest who refused to close his parish was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Tradesmen who'd made their fortunes under her predecessors were suddenly told the crown preferred other suppliers. The reasons given were always for the security of the realm, but the pattern looks uglier when you see it laid out. Fewer voices at the table, locks on doors at odd hours, lists of names that read like a shopping list. You can feel the shift like a temperature drop. The palace moved from grand salon to fortress. The public banquets remained dazzling for the cameras of the day, glitter, fireworks, speeches, but the courtiers started wearing armor under their coats. Habits learned in whispers, alliances stitched behind closed doors. People stopped writing the truth because truth got people shipped off at dawn. Here's where the ambiguity eats at you. Was she an authoritarian by nature, or did the pressure make her into one? Picture her at midnight, alone in the council room, counting threats like beads. Foreign powers pressing, emissaries whispering, a spineless parliament that couldn't protect her even if it wanted to, and she perceives a slow bleed of sovereignty. The decisions get harder. The lines she draws in the sand become walls. A small, understandable paranoia becomes policy. But stories rarely stop at policy. They bleed into rumor ritual even. Healers were summoned late at night. A servant wrote in a kerchief about a midnight rite, candles and mirrors, an old language half translated. The document reads like fever dream prose. She spoke to the dark, and the dark answered. She fed the night, and it grew. Whether it was superstition or statecraft, it fed the international press the narrative they wanted. Dangerous queen, dabbling in things no proper monarch should. At the same time, local voices defended her. They said she kept harvests from failing, kept bandits out of border towns, and refused to bow to foreign demands. To those people, she was a shield made of iron, and sometimes iron cuts. To the empire and its chroniclers, she was cautionary tale. The difference between tyrant and protector is often ink and interest. Comment now. Was she brave or brutal? I'm reading these. You flip farther and find a torn ledger entry where an official, someone with a neat hand, tried to justify a purge. We must act to preserve order. We must be cruel to be kind. It ends with a blot where the pen slipped. Whoever wrote that hand refused to finish the sentence. Now we step into the erasure. Portraits in the National Gallery painted over, manuscripts redacted, entire pages of correspondence missing from the Royal Archive marked simply, removed, confidential. Her name becomes inconvenient. The next generation's textbooks skip a decade and label the era a period of reorganization. Her scandal, deleted, her policies, recast as temporary measures. Her victims, footnotes at best. This is the real horror. Not an unhinged monarch on a rampage, but the slow, methodical cut of memory. People with the power to edit the public story clipped her out like a parasite. Imagine someone taking a pair of scissors to your family album and deciding you'd be better off forgotten. That's what happened to her. Before we move on, quick check. How are you feeling? Curious? Sick? A little queasy? Good. That's normal. History that's been doctored leaves a metallic taste. And that taste reminds you of a simple, usable skill. How to read between edits. If you learn nothing else tonight, watch for the missing lines. Sometimes what's not said is the loudest scream. Now that you've traced the cut headlines, smelled the coal and blood in the margins, and felt the coldness of a palace that can hide bodies and secrets, the story narrows to one place, the throne room, where roses rot behind the gilding, and the crown finally sits on her head. Candle dies. Another one flares. A distant laugh echoes down a stone corridor. You wake up in a Victorian palace marble cold as bone, curtains trembling, and somewhere down the hall a woman laughs once, a laugh that could be either welcome or warning. That's where the main story begins. You wake up on a narrow pallet beneath a high, frescoed ceiling. Morning light tries to push through heavy drapes but is throttled by fog. Your breath fogs in the cold air. The floor beneath the pallet is flagstone that has the polite chill of a grave. You rub your palms together and they come away smelling faintly of coal and something sweeter rose oil, expensive and used too much to disguise other smells. You stand. The corridor outside your room smells like 100 small lives. Boiled porridge, wet wool, the iron tang of old coins. It's the palace's heartbeat. A kitchen organ, a courtyard percussion, a staircase that creaks the same complaint every time someone climbs it. People here learn to walk like ghosts because the wrong noise will get you noticed. You pad down the hall. Tapestries press ancient, warm air back at you. They're stitched with hunting scenes that look too busy, like they're hiding secrets in the brush. The candles on the sconce gutter as if someone walked by and took a breath out of them. You feel watched in the way you do in a church after confession, eyes imagined where there are none. A footman appears as if materialized, thin, quick, the kind of man who has made an art of avoiding the place in his mouth where he swallows his fear. He hands you a silver cup. "Her Majesty will receive," he says, voice clipped, polite, practiced. He does not smile. He will not look you in the eye. That lack of eye contact says more than any insult. Around him, everyone is performing the same economy of movement. Small hands, smaller words. You are shown into the antechamber where the morning light falls in pale rectangles. The salon is the kind of room made for people who are afraid of empty space. Furniture everywhere. A carpet that could swallow a coin. Porcelain glows like false teeth in sunlight. There are flowers, white roses with edges browning already, as if the room itself cannot maintain beauty for long. Then she enters. Not with thunder or trumpet, but with the economy of a ruler who knows cameras and men and the exact angle of a curtsy. She is smaller than portraits would have you expect. Up close, her skin is pale, thin as rice paper. Her hair, piled high, looks like a map of alliances, a curl for this noble, a pin that general. Her dress folds and refolds into itself like a diplomatic treaty. Every pleat a line someone negotiated. She closes the door, and the room exhales. Her smile is a cabinet of possibilities. It's warm enough for public consumption and sharp enough to hide a blade. She speaks like she chooses syllables as one chooses coins. Put these here, that one there. People laugh at her jokes because they know it's cheaper than losing their positions. She asks you where you're from. You tell her. She notes it and nods like she's cataloguing you for a ledger you won't ever see. But the warmth is measured. Notice the way her fingers linger over the rim of a goblet. The way servants step back when she calls for her cane, though she doesn't always need it. Power makes small mechanical gestures look like ritual. Everything about the room is calibrated to hide improvisation. That's the first rule of surviving a court. Nothing surprises the sovereign, and nothing surprises the sovereign's household, because surprise is expensive. As breakfast is served, watch the orchestra of survival. An old maid pretending not to be old, a young clerk whose handwriting will be praised tomorrow and whose name will vanish next month, a guard who jokes too loudly and coughs a little too often afterward. You see the way messages come and go. One rolled parchment, left-handed, folded thrice, passed beneath a silver tray. There is a particular silence in the watchful pause after the monarch speaks. People inhale, arrange their faces into approval, and then exhale like someone holding their breath underwater. Halfway through the morning, an argument flares, soft at first, then sharp like a snapped whisker. A minister challenges a proposed tariff. You watch the Queen's face change. A slight narrowing of the eyes, the kind of domestic quiet thing that can scale to policy. She interrupts with a joke, polite, laced with irony, and the gallery laughs. The minister sits down, blood drained from his face like someone's pulling a curtain. Later that day, he is given a diplomatic post in a colony 3 months' travel away. He smiles when they pin the letter to his chest. His wife packs as if they are going on holiday. Nobody says the real farewell. They never do. You notice tiny clues. A locked door at the end of a corridor you are never allowed to inspect. A ledger missing a page. A maid whose apron has been stitched 3 times on the same hem. Candles that burn down to their stubs and then are taken away by gloved hands. These are the signatures of a court protecting itself, or erasing itself. Learn to read these signatures. They are louder than the proclamations posted on the city gates. Around midday, there's a ceremonial tour of the gardens. The public sees the Queen among trimmed hedges and sculpted fountains, the picture of pastoral benevolence. Private observers notice the gardener's face, drawn, hollowed. He has not slept in days because someone judged his design offensive last week, and he is still paying for that offense with favors he cannot afford. The Queen lingers by a statue of Athena, fingers tracing marble that used to be warm with a previous ruler's fingerprints. She touches the face lightly, like someone who knows how monuments hold grudges. Now, for a breath of dark levity, imagine your modern office had a water cooler where people whispered, and one morning someone vanished after a meeting. That's the palace. The floor lights with chandeliers, and the HR calls with muffled carriage departures, and you have the favor. Humor keeps you sane, and you'll need humor in the palace. Or you'll be the kind who spends your days folding notes into the fire. Here's a test in human reading. A laugh that comes too quickly. A compliment that arrives precisely when a rival is humiliated. A hand extended with the wrong wrist. If you notice these, you're learning the court's grammar. People get punished not only by exile or death, but by being made irrelevant. They suffer the slow erosion of purpose. Many prefer to be shipped off than to drip away in some ceremonial corner of the palace. Before we leave the corridor of breakfast and the trimmed lawns of ceremony, watch the small thing you'd miss if you blinked. A clock wound backward in a private study. In many old houses, clocks that run wrong signal someone cutting time to suit their purposes. Here it signals that history itself is being adjusted. Minutes shaved away, events rearranged, a tidy narrative created for public consumption. If you were here, what would you do? Hide, obey, or plot? Comment below. I'm reading these. A distant door slams, sharp. A carriage bell dings once. Now that you've tasted the palace routine, the smiles, the hush, the sly excision of people from pages, let's step back and ask the next question. Who was this woman before the crown hardened her? Where did she come from, and which choices carved her path to the throne? Where she came from. The making of a queen. Vellum pages rustling. A distant child's laugh, then silence. You follow the faint scuff of polished boots down a corridor that smells like old paper and new fear. The story isn't born at the throne. It starts in some small place where someone first taught her how to keep a secret. Picture her childhood. A narrow town, the kind with chimneys that breathe soot into the sky, and bakeries that keep the windows fogged all winter. Her family wasn't royal by blood, maybe minor gentry, maybe a merchant family with a ledger full of clever lies. She learned early how to bend words into advantages. She learned to read people the way other children read primers. By the time she was old enough to understand the shape of power, she already knew the rules of survival. Who to smile at, who to ignore, where to place her gloves. Court would teach her polish. Life taught her teeth. She was taught by women who stitched calm into the hems of dresses, and by tutors who fed her maps and treaties instead of toys. Etiquette wasn't frivolous to them, It was language. A curtsy could be a contract. A handshake could be a sentence. That rigid social grammar, that instruction manual of how to present, perform, and survive before monarchs, was the porcelain armor she wore in public. Courts ran on rituals that looked like manners, and manners could be the difference between favor and oblivion. You see the moment she met the prince, a ballroom that smelled of orange oil and human pretense, windows sweating with rain, scandalous laughter measured into ribbons. He liked her because she listened in a way that made him feel important. He married her because he thought she was malleable. But people are never that simple. She brought with her a fierce intelligence and a habit of keeping a ledger in her head. Names, debts, promises that people thought private. Her first tests were small but telling. A factory owner cheated her brother in trade, and the family lost a roof. She watched the man keep his fortune and his smile, and she tasted the particular bitterness of impotence. That bitterness taught her how to convert grievance into policy. A tariff here, a monopoly there, favors that rewarded loyalty and punished chicanery. Power felt like a tool because it was won, and she learned to make it do what she wanted. Then grief arrives, the kind that nudges a ruler into darker rooms. Maybe it was the death of a child, maybe the loss of someone who'd trusted her, something that cut clean and left the edges raw. In that country of smoke and tea, grief pushes people toward the uncanny. When the rational world falls short, you start to try the rituals that promise answers. In Victorian and 19th century Britain, the move towards spiritualism, seances, mediums, and the language of contacting the dead was common. People with fresh losses often turned to any method that claimed contact beyond the grave. That cultural current made private rituals less scandalous and more believable. So she experimented. At first it was simple. A candle lit, a bracelet put on a map, a whispered request for guidance. A woman in a palace with nothing left to lose will try anything that suggests conversation with those gone. The court called some practices eccentric, others madness, and the gossip mills, always hungry for drama, began to spin. Whether she ever truly believed she spoke to spirits is less important than the fact that belief gave her something to act on. Counsel, ritual, and the public theater of control. There's another practical fear that shaped her rule: poisons. In the 19th century, arsenic and similar substances were everywhere, used in pigments, in wallpapers, and even sold in general stores, so the possibility of being quietly removed by a cup of tea was not a paranoid fantasy. Danger people knew about. Because poison could be slipped into a household without obvious signs, it made private power struggles lethal in a way that public fights were not. The era's poisonous ubiquity taught rulers to mistrust the friendly gesture and to read every meal like a contract. She internalized that security calculus. If the world could kill by a teaspoon, then secrecy and a smaller inner circle were survival tactics. You learn to reward loyalty by keeping favorites close, and to punish perceived disloyalty by exile or economic ruin. Not always dramatic, but effective. The palace became a place of small violences: dismissed appointments, reassigned posts, empty invitations sent with warm handwriting. Those petty cruelties stacked up into a system. If you can't publicly execute a rival, you can perform exile one letter, one train ticket at a time. A pivotal fracture in her life was also political. Foreign envoys who wanted her jewels in exchange for peace, ministers who whispered compromises in the night, and the constant pressure of empires sniffing for weakness. She discovered that being liked by London or Paris often meant sacrificing homegrown artisans and local ministers. The choice presented itself like a forked road: sell the country's assets for a treaty that would bring temporary peace, or hold the line and risk isolation. She chose isolation at times, and those choices hardened public opinion against her in places that mattered, and sometimes those people had pens. Now you know how the private wound and public pressure braided into a single motive force. A queen who starts as curious becomes exacting, because exacting wins you time and security. A woman who once read maps now reads people, who will betray her, who will sing her praises for profit, who will be quietly dangerous. Those early mechanics of her life, loss, survival training, practical fear, and a taste for the language of ritual, become the engine of decisions that later look monstrous. A final, ugly truth to sit with. Records do not always survive. Those who control archives can excise inconvenient chapters. Governments and institutions have rearranged or removed sensitive documents before, sometimes to hide malpractice, sometimes to protect reputations. That means the ledger in her head might be the only complete diary of motives and choices we will ever glimpse. In other words, the story you're hearing may already be missing pages. If you were born into power, would you play the long game like she did, or risk everything for a single reckless truth? Drop your vote. #long game or #one truth. A slow, careful closing of a wooden box. You've seen the map of her making. The small town, the ledgered mind, the loss that pushed her toward ritual, the practical terror of poison, and the political pressures that hardened her choices. This is the hinge. On one side sits the charming consort, who learned to laugh in the ballroom. On the other sits the sovereign, who learned the grammar of silence. Now that you know where she came from, and what shaped her hunger for control, let's move to the public face of her rule. I will show the charming beginning, the public adoration, the porcelain and music, and the slow, almost polite pivot from beloved to feared. The charming beginning, the queen the crowd cheered for. Brass band warming up, a muffled roar that swells and then becomes hush. You push through the crowd. It's a blanket of wool coats and top hats, carriage wheels hissing on wet cobbles, and the smell of horse sweat and coal smoke that somehow smells like a city trying to stay awake. Pennants snap in the foggy air. A boy 3 rows ahead holds a hand-drawn sign that reads, "Long live the crown." He waves it like a flag he stole from fate. She appears not like a myth, but like a perfectly timed photograph. A pale face, a jeweled sash, a carriage that seems to float on the collective breath of the crowd. The band strikes up, hats tilt, and people cry out. Up close you notice little theatrical things she does to be adored. An exaggerated nod to a widow by the rail, a leaf of lace lifted to a child who reaches up for a coin, a laugh exactly when the crowd needs relief. These are not accidents. She has learned that rulership is partly show business, and she performs like she's been rehearsing since childhood. Pageantry matters. Coronations, processions, and public appearances are not just pomp. They are instruments of power. Crowds were central to a ruler's legitimacy. They create a story the chroniclers can't ignore. The old procession ways and coronation rituals were designed precisely to make the public feel included in the spectacle of sovereignty. That ritualized spectacle makes people believe a person is more than a person. It makes the sovereign a symbol. You see her philanthropic face in that first year. Schoolhouses opened with crimson ribbons, soup kitchens photographed in the penny papers, model factories where the machines hum and the posters read "Prosperity under her rule." She rides through new rail lines like a patron saint of progress. That first wave of goodwill is powerful. Beneath it sits a political contract, gratitude traded for support. The growing mass press of the era, cheap papers and illustrated broadsheets that could be printed quickly and sold cheaply, spread her image like wallpaper across cities and villages. The press made heroes, and then, if it chose, monsters. Sensory detail. The cheering tastes like iron and sugar. The candy boys sell pennies of sweetness to the crowd. Banners smell faintly of damp linen and resin glue, and the carriage wheels sing a metallic lullaby. She smells of roses and lemon oil, expensive scent intended to suggest cleanliness in a world of coal grime. People press forward to touch the hem of her robe, and someone whispers that she once gave a sovereign coin to a beggar that saved his family. Myth grows as quickly as rumor in those moments. Her charm has method. She knows which photographers to favor, which charities to visit on rainy Thursdays when the press will run human interest pieces, which poor districts to show mercy in when policy needs a softer face. The era's expanding press meant image crafting was no longer optional. It became essential. Penny papers and illustrated magazines created a new kind of accountability, one that rewards spectacle and punishes missteps in the bright light of mass attention. Here's the first pivot, subtle as a shadow passing over a stage. At court, she begins to cultivate a particular set of impressions: tough love for the elite, mercy for the simple. She makes speeches about sovereignty, about protecting our industry, and preserving our culture. In practice, that looks like protective tariffs, new contracts awarded to craftspeople loyal to the crown, and an insistence that certain foreign missionaries and traders be watched more closely. To the crowd at the ribbon cutting, it sounds like patriotism. To merchants and some ministers, it feels like a shiv under the collar. That tension will widen. Another crunch of reality under the gloss. Victorian society loved mysteries. Seances, mediums, and the language of spirits were fashionable among many, especially in grieving households. Public fascination with spiritualism meant a sovereign who flirted with the occult could be seen as charismatic by some and suspect by others. If she held private seances or hosted public demonstrations, they would function like rhetorical theater, a way to tell people she had access to hidden knowledge, to the dead, to counsel that other leaders did not. That aura of secret counsel bolsters political gravitas for some and feeds suspicion for others. Spiritualism was not fringe. It was widely practiced and discussed in the period, which made its use as a political prop plausible. Little contradictions accumulate. At a public banquet, she smiles at a delegation from a neighboring nation. The papers next morning carry flattering engravings. But behind the scene, ministers quietly redraw trade maps, setting import quotas that redirect profits toward allies of the crown. A favored artisan is awarded a royal warrant, an honor that turns into a monopoly that swallows competitors. Praise in public, cuts in private. That's how gentle governance begins to look like governance with teeth. And then there's the gendered attack that will follow her like a shadow. Victorian medical culture had a language, hysteria, that doctors used to label women whose behavior men found threatening or incomprehensible. Powerful women in the 19th century risked being pathologized. A laugh that was once charming could be rebranded as a symptom, a tear as a diagnosis. That weaponized medicine made it easier for critics to call her unstable rather than justify political opposition on policy grounds. The term hysteria and its application during the era turned women's power into a medical spectacle as often as a political one. Imagine you're in the crowd at the palace fete, and you overhear two conversations. One woman praises the school the queen opened. A man on the corner mutters that the same queen plays with spirits and drives ministers mad. Which conversation will make tomorrow's paper? Both. But the paper will edit the tone to sell more copies. And the tone is the blade that will soon split public affection into fear. If you were a journalist then, would you print the feel-good story or the scandal? Tell me below. A soft tear of paper, the clap of a program being folded. Now that the applause has taught her how to rule with spectacle, and you felt how a crowd can be swayed by a ribbon cut and a photograph, The scene narrows. Little exclusions start to stack into a pattern. Foreign envoys quietly snubbed, missionaries whose privileges are rescinded, and rivals rewarded with distant governorships. Those small governance moves create enemies in places that matter: trade houses, foreign embassies, and the press. Next, watch the first real cracks: servants disappearing, an envoy who gets sick after a state dinner, whispers of rituals that go beyond roses and ribbon cutting. The crack in the crown: servants vanish, an envoy falls. Long, low gong, a silver tray placed down with more force than necessary, a swallow, a knife slid into a plate. You are at a state banquet. Goblets clink like small bells. Roast pheasant steams under a silver dome. Horses smell like the promise of spring. Laughter is measured, polite. An orchestra keeping tempo so no one improvises a scandal. You eat because not eating is a statement, and statements here have consequences. Halfway through the second course, the envoy from across the sea pauses. His face goes slack, first pale, then a tight red bloom, as if someone has pinched a bruise across his cheeks. He coughs once, then again, and the laughter awkwardly dies. Someone lifts his chin, and his tongue is swollen. He retches into a napkin. The head of the table blinks like a hunted animal. By night's end, he's gone. A carriage bound for the hospital, or the governor's summer house. Official stories change. This is the story that moves like a rumor through the palace. Someone ate something they shouldn't have. Someone's soup tasted metallic and sweet. Someone's breath smelled of flowers and old coins. In an age when arsenic brightened wallpaper greens and tinted fabrics, poisoning wasn't a paranoid fantasy. It was a real, practical hazard. Bright green dyes like Sheely's green contained arsenic and were widely used in 19th century interiors. Medical and museum studies trace real sicknesses and even deaths to arsenic-tainted decor and household products. Now watch how the palace rearranges itself like a wound trying to clot. A doctor is sent. He writes notes in a crabbed hand. Collapse. Acute gastric distress. Seizure. Another doctor of the court suggests a nervous disorder. If the victim is female or outspoken, the phrase hysteria might appear in the ledger in the next weeks. A catch-all diagnosis. Victorian medicine used to explain unwelcome female behavior and to delegitimize political or social disobedience. That medical language could function like law. Declare a woman ill, and you remove her from the public conversation without the ugly spectacle of a trial. Rumors begin to split into two directions. One side whispers of accident, a tray swapped in the scullery, a poisoned pigeon, bad oysters. The other side, much louder in certain salons and in the cheap illustrated papers, speaks in conspiracies. A queen who dabbles in night rites, a kitchen brigand bribed to do a job, a court that punishes rivals quietly. Spiritualism and seances were mainstream enough in the 19th century that a ruler's flirtation with the occult would have been plausible fodder for gossip, and also a dangerous political tool. To invite the dead to speak is to suggest you have access to counsel your rivals do not. To stage a séance is to manufacture the aura of secret power. Both possibilities terrify opponents and thrill believers. The press turns every whisper into copy. The mid-century explosion of illustrated weeklies and mass circulation papers gave editors an appetite for scandal and a toolbox for shaping public feeling. Engravings, sensational leads, and moralizing editorials make the palace into a theater of rumor. A single sketch or biting caption can turn a curious private practice into a public crime. The crowd outside your palace gates learns not the nuance of policy, but the rhythm of outrage. Inside, measures multiply. Names that once sat on the council table now appear on lists of reassignment. A minister who argued for freer trade receives a kind letter and a posting on the other side of the world. A kitchen head who knows too many things is quietly dismissed for health reasons. People are not always murdered to be silenced. More effective and less traceable are removal, exile, and professional ruin. The machinery of governance becomes a hiding place for retribution. Contracts awarded to friends, tax audits that ruin opponents, licenses quietly revoked. It's a slow, bureaucratic sort of violence. Less bloody, but just as decisive. You sense the palace itself has a new throat, the whisper network. There are watchers in the galleries, old maids with knotted faces, and younger servants who have learned to count the breaths between sentences. There are hastily convened inquiries, with locked doors and men with pleasant faces who ask questions like a surgeon presses a wound. Light, clinical, and always searching for the one phrase that will close a case. The sovereign's inner circle becomes an information market. Rumors sold in silence, favors traded for loyalty, and secrets kept like currency. At night, when the servants shuffle out and the candles pool like small moons, there are fresher, stranger noises. A mirror tapped at midnight. A prayer chanted in a language no one in the antechamber can translate. A ledger passed under a tray. Whether these are superstition, performance, or statecraft is the tension that keeps the palace alive. To her supporters, the rituals are governance, an old-world logic translated to a modern court. To her critics, they are proof of a dangerously private sovereign, afraid of daylight and flourishing in shadow. Which would you be, whistleblower or survivor? Comment now. A single footstep, then silence. Now that the cracks have started to show, dinners that kill, doctors that label, newspapers that amplify. Watch how these threads tighten into policy. In next one, we'll trace the moment the Queen tastes power as an intoxication. How small reprisals become permanent policy. How fear becomes an instrument. And how charm turns into calculation. The palace is changing from a stage into a fortress. Let's go deeper. The taste of power. How little cruelties hardened into policy. Deeper, longer, aligned to the main story. You watch her from the gallery as the applause dies and the doors close. The crown glints, not regal so much as hungry. Power is a flavor. At first it's like sweet wine. Sip enough and it turns sharp, then bitter, then something that makes your mouth dry and your hands tremble. That's the moment she learns the real lesson of rulership. You can make people obey in many small ways that never look like force. Look at what happens next. Policies arrive like polite notes, a tariff for protection, a contract awarded for services rendered, a regulation for the good of public morals. On paper, these are dry things. Line items, clauses, stamps. Up close, they're teeth. One small tariff ruins a merchant. One contract gives a family their livelihood back. One safety law closes a rival's factory. Power learns the language of bureaucracy, because bureaucracy makes punishment soft-edged and untraceable. It won't make headlines. Sometimes that's the point. This is not theory. In the 19th century, the instruments for shaping public opinion and hiding consequences were real. The new mass circulation press and illustrated weeklies could lift you up or tear you down, and government offices could reassign or exile people quietly to distant colonial postings, every bit as effective as a scandal but much cleaner on the books. The era's printing revolution made scandal a commodity and also a weapon. You learn to read the small moves. A private reprimand becomes an invitation to govern in a far-off dominion. A rival's ledger is audited until the numbers scream. Creditors are nudged, licenses delayed, trades rerouted. No single stroke of violence, no public executions, just a slow bleed of status and influence until the person is gone. In court, people call it reorganization. In parlors, people call it expedience. To the victims, it's death by paperwork. There's a delicious cruelty in that. It hides the sovereign's hand. She becomes a gardener of people, prune here, snip there, shaping the resentments so they never become uprisings. Imagine how a modern office would look if HR could reassign your rival to a different continent, and the news only printed that you were taking a sabbatical. The palace learned to weaponize normalcy. Power also teaches paranoia. The world literally contained hidden poisons, bright green wallpapers, arsenic-laden pigments, and chemicals used in fabrics and dyes that could make people sick without dramatic signs. So the idea that a soup, a scarf, or a chintz could be lethal wasn't wild fantasy. It was real danger people understood. That everyday risk made private revenge practical and frighteningly simple. And then there's the medical theater. When critics grew loud, when a rival's voice became inconvenient, the tools of 19th century medicine were ready to be turned into political instruments. Labeling someone unwell, diagnosing nervousness or hysteria, or prescribing a rest cure could remove a voice from the conversation without the mess of a trial. For powerful women in that era, hysteria was a dangerous word. It made leadership look like illness and debate look like delusion. Once you can call a woman ill, you don't have to argue. You simply remove her stage. Watch how her private measures become public policy. What begins as protective measures, inspecting imports, restricting certain missionaries or merchants, morphs into a system of exclusion. People who once passed papers at her table find themselves reassigned to islands, their letters home delayed, their presence in the capital a memory. The court's grammar changes. Favors are now currency, silence a requirement, loyalty an economic investment. But let's not romanticize. She believed, in the language of rulers everywhere, that she was saving something. The same hands that signed exile also signed grain subsidies for a town on the edge of starvation. To locals sometimes, she was both tyrant and protector. That moral ambiguity is what makes her story stick in the throat. What looks monstrous to one person can look like salvation to another. Which is exactly why her opponents had to erase some of her lines from the record. Ambiguity doesn't sell newspapers, but scandal does. The rituals deepen. Late-night councils, candles, anointed churches closed for order, ministers encouraged to accept other posts. Some people call it governance, others call it cruelty dressed up as caution. But the effect is the same. Fear slides into the bones of the palace. Servants laugh less. Correspondence grows formal and clipped. Trust becomes a currency she hoards. At the same time, the public face is still polished. A program for the schools is distributed, and a photograph, an engraving really, of the Queen reading to children is printed in broadsheets across the city. The same press that once sold her image will later sell whispers about seances and madness. The machinery that made her could, and ultimately did, unmake her. Here's the human skill you need in a palace like this. Learn when to bow and when to record. Bow to survive. Keep receipts in your head. Pay attention to who keeps records and who destroys them. The Queen's secret was simple. She protected her rule by making the consequences administrative and the penalties social. That made her efficient and invisible. Ask yourself, what would you do inside that room? Would you quietly build alliances, keep your mouth shut and fetch the right goblet? Or would you be the person willing to make a scene and risk exile? Drop a comment now. #bow or burn. I'm watching. Now that you've seen how small acts of governance can become instruments of fear, and how the press, bureaucracy, and medicine can be wielded to silence, let's step in closer. In next, we'll put you in the courtier's shoes. a smile that freezes, a laugh that stops mid-sentence, and the exact moment you realize the woman who once charmed you has learned to use charm as a blade. The courtiers wake up when charm turns into a blade. A single leather boot on a marble stair. A hush like a curtain closing. A distant clock counting out the polite seconds. You are a courtier now. Maybe by birth, maybe by luck. You arrive with a small satchel of manners and debts. A mother's recipe for negotiation. A father's tally of favors owed. The palace smells like lacquer and lemons. The chandeliers drip wax like slow rain. You think you know the script? Bow. Speak when spoken to. Smile until your cheeks cramp. Tonight you discover there's a second script, the one they don't print. The queen receives you with that practiced warmth. A tilt of chin, a soft laugh. The kind of attention that makes you feel like you just found a coin under your shoe. She asks about your family, names noted casually, then moves on to praise a rival's latest pamphlet in a voice so bright the rival beams. You go back to your desk thinking you've won a favor. 2 days later, a letter is pinned to the same rival's desk, appointed by Her Majesty's kindness to the governorship of a distant island. He smiles at the send-off. He leaves with a farewell feast and an unburdened look. To the crowd, it's honor. To the court, it's exile. Political reassignment, gilded and bureaucratic, has become the gentlest form of removal. You start to notice the grammar of control. A compliment carefully timed buys silence. A patronage letter, apparently generous, is a pocket knife in plain leather. The Queen's laughter is a metronome. When she speeds it up, the room relaxes. When she slows it down, people who are talking stop mid-sentence. Small humiliations, an omitted name from a public proclamation, a retweeting paper that mentions someone's health. Read, mental fragility. Do a work that violence used to do, but cleaner. Bureaucracy becomes the weapon of choice because it leaves neat paper trails that can be edited, and it allows rulers to say, "This was done for the good of the realm." Watch the quiet medical theatre unfold. A woman at court who questions a policy is described as nervous. A sympathetic doctor recommends rest and quiet, what people call the rest cure, and she is sent away for her health. In that era, medical diagnoses like hysteria function not only as science, but as a social tool. An easy, professional-sounding way to remove a woman's voice without accusations or trials. Think of it as a polite erasure, the kind that feeds on sympathy and legal-sounding language and makes protest look like pathology. Now the press arrives. Ink on cheap paper, engravings that exaggerate the curl of her smile, and gossip columns that stitch one rumor to another. Newspapers in the 19th century reached huge new audiences. The cheap illustrated papers and weeklies could build a reputation or burn one in a single edition. A flattering engraving after a palace fete will make the crowd cheer. A sensational sketch implying occult rites will make them wary and hungry for accusations. The same technology that brought her fame can, in a heartbeat, magnify suspicion. There are other, more poisonous instruments too. Not always metaphorical. The world you live in contains real everyday poisons. Arsenic in green pigments, toxic dyes and wallpapers that made people ill in subtle, lingering ways. Because of that reality, the idea that a meal, a scarf, or a wallpaper might quietly break someone down isn't fantasy. It's an understood risk. In a palace that already practices soft retribution, the possibility of hidden chemical harm makes survival a matter of reading small signs. Blackened fingertips on a tray, a servant who suddenly gets sick after touching a particular curtain. These aren't modern conspiracy theories. They were 19th century facts people worried about. All of this changes the way you navigate human beings. You learn to file small slights like receipts in your mind. Who said what and when? Which hand passed the cup? Which foot tapped when the queen frowned? You learn to love the people who know how to be useful and to fear the people who smile too much. You learn to keep a ledger of favors in a secret place and a separate ledger of slights where names go to die. There are grotesque moments, little comedies that curdle into horror. Once, at a private supper, a tradesman makes the faintest joke about corruption. The queen laughs so loudly the chandeliers rock. Applause floods out. That tradesman later finds his business losing contracts to a royal-backed competitor. He tells himself it's coincidence. His wife stitches the hems on new dresses and spends nights counting coins until she forgets the sound of laughter. The palace's quiet cruelty is most effective because it looks like ordinary governance, paperwork, favors, and market forces. But it's guided by a woman who has learned to make mercy look like a policy and retribution feel like a necessity. You start to see the moral calculus. She believes the ends justify the means, and she is not alone in thinking it. There are ministers who whisper that sovereignty cannot survive openness, and supporters who say the world is a wolf pack, and only the alpha survives. To those people, removing a rival by paperwork or health leave is sensible. To the people who vanish slowly, it is a different story, a slow attrition of dignity. On-screen prompt. If you were a courtier, would you keep receipts or burn them? Type hash, keep receipts or hash burn them. I'll read the answers. SFX. A soft scrape as a letter is sealed. A carriage wheel rolls away. The psychological toll is slow and cunning. Courtiers who survive learn to speak in code. They practice compliments that are also warnings. They wear masks of amusement while their hands reset the table settings. And the queen, she perfects the performance. Charm becomes not a disguise but a tool. She disarms, draws trust, and then redirects that trust into mechanisms of control. The blade is invisible because it's embedded in ritual, charity, and the language of public good. Now that you've felt the courtier's awakening, that moment where you realize the applause is also a trap, our next scene pulls back the curtains on the rituals themselves. Was her private magic superstition, theater, or statecraft? In Scene 8, we step into the candlelit rooms, the covered mirrors, and the midnight councils, where spirit calling and political calculation begin to overlap. SFX, someone raps 3 times on a mirror. A candle flame bends toward a whisper. The rituals, mirrors, candles, and statecraft. You are led down a narrow passage where the air has no business being warm. The corridor smells of wax and orange oil, with a faint, strange undernote, iron and herbs, something like the metallic tang of hennies left in rain. The servants' footsteps are muffled. Even their fears have learned to pad them. There's a half door you have never been given the right key for. Tonight, that door opens. Beyond it is a room that seems designed to confuse light. Candles stand in odd clusters, catching their reflections in mirrors covered with lace. The furniture has been pushed back, as if to make space for something not usually permitted in daylight. On a low table sits an object that makes your skin prickle. A glass bowl so clear it looks like a hole in the world. Around it, folded pieces of paper, a silver coin, a small bone, tokens the court calls council. And in the center of them all sits the queen, draped in shadow and silver, a single candle balanced on a carved stone between her palms. If you'd seen her in the garden hours earlier, you'd have believed in her mercy. Here, in the candlelight, mercy takes a different shape. It's a ritual, and ritual is a language of power. She speaks quietly, but with absolute precision, reading from a script only she can see. The words are old, some Latin, some fragments from older tongues, and the men and women around her repeat them, like a chorus of people selling a truth. You feel the syllables settle in the room like dust. This is where statecraft and spiritualism begin to overlap. In the 19th century, spiritualism, seances, mediums, attempts to summon or consult the dead, was widespread enough to be respected among certain circles. For a sovereign, inviting the language of the dead into governance is two things at once: theatre for the public imagination and a tool in the politics of fear. If you can show you consult something beyond living counsel, you can claim knowledge others don't possess. That claimed knowledge becomes leverage. Watch what the ritual does. First, it filters the court. People who are willing to sit in candlelight and speak the unsayable are people who will later obey quietly. Those who shrink or joke are observed. A servant who leaves the room pale and trembling is noted in a ledger and later offered a health position in the provinces. A junior aide who laughs is quietly cut out of future meetings. The ritual functions as a loyalty test in slow motion. Compliance equals trust. Discomfort equals risk. The queen learns to let superstition be her sieve. Second, it manufactures narrative. The room's theatrics leak out in controlled drips. An anonymous excerpt in a paper about the sovereign who communes with her ancestors. A drawing of the queen framed with stars and dark clouds. To some, that leak is awe. To others, danger. But either way, it creates a private brand. She is not only politically savvy, she is mysteriously advised. That aura makes ministers pause. If she has counsel that might be supernatural, who is to argue? Powerful people dislike competing with the unknown. Newspapers will later twist this into lurid copy. For now, the ritual buys her a margin of unchallengeable authority. Third, the ritual is a tool for confession and confession's cousin, coercion. People brought into the candlelight begin to speak differently. The combination of low light, long ritual, and repeated phrases can loosen tongues. A clever sovereign can coax admissions, real or manufactured, out of a flustered official. Those admissions become currency. A whispered regret in the dark becomes a public accusation the next morning, followed by quiet reassignment. You begin to see the pattern. Ceremony yields testimony. Testimony yields paper. Paper yields an official reason to cut someone from the court. In the palace ledger, it will read like due process. In the diner gossip, it will be the witching. The machinery of ritual feeds the machinery of governance. The sensory details matter. The wax smell sinks into your clothes. The mirrors collect candle spark and then seem to swallow it. The glass bowl breathes faintly cold air. Occasionally there are sounds that the modern mind wants to rationalize away. A clap. A breath like a sigh from under the floor, but in the moment they feel like answers. You see the queen's pupils dilate. A bead of sweat rolls down her temple. She smiles, and the smile reads like relief. If she is performing for effect, it's a convincing performance. If she truly believes, it's devotion. Either way, the room's power is real because people believe in it. There's a scene you won't forget. A maid pushed to the edge of the circle, trembling, pressed the silver coin into the bowl, and whispered the name of a woman who spoke out at the market. The room swallowed the name. 2 weeks later, that woman's shop lost a lucrative contract. A royal warrant was given to someone else. The maid, who said she acted because she feared the dark would take the wrong names if she didn't, was rewarded with a needlework post in a distant manor, her face memorized only by one other woman who keeps the secret in the seam of a hem. Small mercies, small banishments. The ritual becomes an apparatus of selection. Those chosen to sit are safe. Those who are not are quietly rearranged. Not everyone believes in the supernatural aspects. There are whispered accounts of priests and scientists, some curious, some skeptical, who sit in the next room and watch the show. One minister reports that the queen uses the sessions like files. She takes from them a kind of evidence, he said, a letter lay on a drawer, and turns it into law. Whether he meant the rituals to be metaphysical or merely manipulative is unclear. What is clear is the pattern. After a particularly intense session, policy follows that isolates opponents and supports allies. The ritual and the ledger move like two hands on the same clock. And then, because rituals attract attention, rumor grows teeth. Papers that once printed a coronation engraving begin to print sketches of masked figures, of midnight gatherings. The caricaturists have a field day. The crowd starts to gaze up at the palace windows at night and imagine specters. It doesn't matter if specters exist. It matters that people now expect to see them. Expectation is a political force. When people fear a leader, they police themselves. They stay obedient because obedience feels like safety. You learn a practical rule in that room. Never confuse performance for harmlessness. The glitter of ceremony masks intent. You also learn a survival skill. Count the people who leave with a smile and the people who leave with a note. The former are the ones keeping their names in the ledger. The latter will be the margins. Would you take part in a ritual for power, or refuse and risk exile? Comment #rule or #refuse. I'll read them. Now that you've seen the rituals, how they test loyalty, produce narrative, and convert confessions into governance, there's one more grim step. The public narrative changes. The papers begin to call her possessed. The ministers start to whisper, dangerous, and private testimony hardens into a public story. We follow that public hardening, how whispers become accusations, how the caricatures become headlines, and how the Queen's private rites help birth a public monster. The monster is born, how rumor became headline, the clack and groan of a printing press, a boy's cry, "Extra! Extra!" A crowd's low susurrus building like weather. You're standing on a damp corner, the morning smell of ink and hot paper in your nostrils. A newsboy shoves a sheet into your hands. An engraving of the Queen with a crown that looks more like a thorn wreath, her eyes shaded black, a sketch of candles and mirrors in the background. The headline is theatrical. The Palace and the Past, Ritual or Ruination. And it feels like someone just slit open a seam you didn't know you had. This is the moment the private becomes public. The press, cheap illustrated weeklies, penny broadsheets, and moralizing columns, takes the court's candlelight and turns it into a stage show. A single exaggerated sketch, a single accusation printed in bold, moves faster than any apology. Engravers sharpen lines into fangs. Cartoonists give her a smile like a crescent moon with teeth. The image sells papers and sales beget repetition. Repetition becomes belief. The monster is not born from one night of occult rites, but from 1,000 small prints, 1,000 whispered conversations. You read on. An editorial calls her unnatural. Another writer likens her to ancient tyrants. And a clergyman pens a sermon that will be excerpted in several papers. Where the sovereign speaks with the dead, the living lose their rights. That sermon becomes copy. The caricaturists have a field day. She is depicted leading shadowy processions. A scepter doubles a wand. The image circulates in taverns and workshops. People who never enter the palace now know what to fear. But headlines don't appear in a vacuum. They are fed. Someone, an insider, a rival, a frightened servant, leaks a fragment of a ledger, a late-night entry, a note of a name, a sum handed for security. An artist copies it. A journalist spins a narrative. You start to see the anatomy of a smear. Leak sketch, editorial, sermon, petition. It's efficient, it's deadly. It's also human. Someone wanted a grief addressed. Someone else wanted an office. Someone wanted to sell papers. Motive and market find the same market stall. Now feel the geometry of reaction. In the city squares, People who once cheered the ribbon-cutting now were with the gravity of newly frightened citizens. A widow who got a coin from the Queen a year ago still remembers the soup kitchen. A tradesman who lost a contract last month remembers the invoice. The press tells both stories and sets them rubbing against each other until he develops. The result is a slow combustion. Admiration, catching fire in suspicion. You see the machinery of institutions shift into alignment. Parliament convenes an inquiry with all the politeness of a family court, but with the appetite of a lynch mob. Clergy demand explanations. Foreign envoys send discreet notes home. Her Majesty's policies worry investors. A merchant guild quietly withdraws pledges. The Queen's supporters gather in small, tense rooms and plan defensive pamphlets. Her critics sharpen their pens. The palace braces itself for a storm it can't simply smile away. There is a pivotal day you'll hear about in accounts. The session when a formerly loyal confidant, a lady who once braided the Queen's hair, takes the stand and testifies. She speaks of candle-lit nights and words whispered into bowls. She mentions names. The press seizes on every line and sets it in italics. Betrayal is a dramatic instrument. It sells, it wounds, it frames a human being as a spectacle. Whether coerced, convinced, or complicit, the witness's voice becomes the thread that ties private ceremonies to public guilt. The Queen's image changes not because she stopped doing good things, she didn't, but because context matters. A grain subsidy looks different when read next to a printed allegation of spirit counsel that supposedly ordered a dismissal. A school opening looks more sinister when the same paper pairs the story with an engraving of midnight suns. Context reframes action. The hand that appointed a teacher is the one accused of appointing shadows. Sensory details anchor the moment. The metallic bite on the tongue when you taste the paper as you read. The hiss of wet coats under gaslight as people gather to discuss the news. The bitter aftertaste of tea as conversation sours. The atmosphere is febrile. Heat in the head, tightness behind the eyes. Anger and fear and curiosity mix into an intoxicant the city breathes. People who have never seen the palace feel they now know it intimately. There are strategic actors at work. Rival ministers use the press as a scalpel, cutting away her influence with targeted leaks. Caricaturists partner with pamphleteers. Sermons become op-eds. Even foreign governments get involved, either by whispering to their merchants to divest, or by encouraging press pieces that destabilize domestic support. The phenomenon is modern in its mechanics. Imagine coordinated social media campaigns, think tank briefings, and late-night cable panel discussions. Only the technologies are presses, pamphlets, and pulp. The effect is the same. Manufactured outrage that morphs into political reality. And then comes the erasure campaign. Portraits are retouched. Tilting cheekbones, changing the set of a mouth. Family histories are edited. School books gloss over an entire decade. Archives are reorganized. If her name remains, it appears in footnotes with euphemisms, a period of difficult governance, an interregnum. The removal is clinical and bureaucratic and insidious. It's not a bonfire of books, but a quieter excision. Pages excised, captions rewritten, donors' funds rerouted. You do not need a mob to make someone forgotten. You need only editors and ledger keeps. The palace is soon a library full of blank spaces. The monster becomes the margin. Pause here. Ask yourself, did the Queen become monstrous because she was cruel? Or because 1,000 human motives, fear, profit, rivalry, assembled a story that fit a pre-existing appetite for the scam? Comment below, #made a monster or #rewritten, and tell me which side you land on. I read every one. The press clacks glowing. A stage torn out and burned. Now that the press has done its work and institutions have begun to turn, painting portraits, editing archives, and whispering away reputations, Our next scene pulls back into the palace to watch the personal unraveling. How the Queen reacts when the world calls her a monster, and how private cruelty and public pressure collide. Public versus private. When the world calls you a monster, a carriage wheel thudding to a halt, a distant shout, the soft rasp of pages being folded into a newspaper. You watch it happen in slow, awful motion, first on paper, then in faces. The morning papers arrive like a frost. Headlines that bite, engravings that sharpen a smile into a snarl. The crowd who tossed flowers at the carriage now pauses on the curb and stares up at the palace windows, searching for the caricature they read about. The press took the palace's candlelight and turned it into a lantern to scare people. That's how reputations are burned in public. Cheap, illustrated weeklies and mass circulation papers made spectacle profitable and scandal contagious. Inside the palace, the mood changes like the weather. Curtains are drawn earlier, servants move with new purpose, and the Queen, who once measured her gestures for applause, learns to measure them to a different rhythm. Threat management. She is not always dramatic. Often she is paperwork quiet. Late-night signings, terse memos, lists of names crossed in a different ink. You are near enough to hear the small sounds, the staccato of a pen, the soft crumple of a letter she decides must go away. Public crisis rewrites private ritual. The rituals she practiced for control become defenses against narrative. The smear campaign is a machine in itself. Leaks, engravings, sermons and pamphlets that feed one another until the town square hums. Illustrated caricatures are especially brutal. Artists exaggerate her features. Printmakers add candlelit shadows, and the image slides into the public imagination faster than a retraction can fix it. The same newspapers that spread her photos and charity work now run the cartoons that make people fear her. That cycle, image, outrage, repeat, was the 19th century version of viral media. She feels the squeeze. Many monarchs would rage or retreat. She does both, in turns. Furious letters to ministers, then, hours later, a private séance to consult the dead, because the certainty of ritual steadies her hands. Spiritualism gave Victorians a language for grief and authority. When a ruler used it, observers could interpret the practice either as genuine counsel or theatrical self-protection. Either way, that language became political capital or political kryptonite. Now the palace has two campaigns running at once. The public campaign to defend her name and the private campaign to secure her rule. The private campaign gets meaner. Medical men, armed with the language of nerves and nerves cures, are quietly helpful allies. If a critic is inconvenient and also nervous, there is an easy remedy on the shelf: diagnosis, rest, removal. The so-called rest cure, prescribed for nervous and hysterical women, became a real tool in this era for sidelining outspoken people covertly. If you can declare dissent pathological, you don't have to argue with it. You simply treat it. Rumor does the rest. People whisper about poisoned wallpaper. Remember that vivid, impossible green pigment that seemed magical and deadly at once. In damp rooms, arsenic-based greens could break down and create poisonous compounds. In any case, arsenic was a known household hazard in the century, so the idea of a meal or a curtain as weapon fit easily into public fear. Whether the palace literally used wallpaper or whether the idea simply caught fire in gossip, the effect is the same. Everyday objects become suspects, and trust becomes a scarce commodity. You watch allies thin out. Ambassadors who once courted her now send timid dispatches. Tradespeople who benefited from royal warrants suddenly get letters suggesting they relocate for business reasons. Portraits are retouched in official galleries, cheeks softened, eyes adjusted, whole expressions reworked over later varnish, so later viewers will face a different woman in their textbooks. Meanwhile, archivists reorganize boxes and mark some correspondence confidential. Erasure rarely looks like a bonfire. It looks like administration, neat, plausible, and permanent. The Queen's private fury becomes more measured and more efficient. Public forgiveness is bought by charity, public appearances, new schools. Private punishment is bought by paperwork, quiet transfers, and the strategic use of health leave. The same hands that give grain subsidies also sign orders that dry up a rival's contracts. You feel the moral vertigo. Is she defending a nation or defending herself at the expense of others? The same act can be read as protection or brutality depending on which paper you read. If you could ask her one thing, what would it be? Drop it in the comments. I'll read them. There's a human cost. Imagine the shopkeeper whose account is quietly frozen. Imagine the maid who is suddenly offered a position in the country and never speaks of why she left. These are tactics that do not make headlines until someone decides to leak them. But the slow violence of administrative erasure leaves scars as deep as any public execution. Now, a quick skill for handling humans, because you ask for survival tricks. When someone is attacked in public through image or rumor, watch what they do privately. Do they double down with visible generosity, performative defense? Or do they shore up a small inner circle, consolidating power? Both are signals. If you're in a position where you must navigate that space, measure smiles for duration, watch who sits closest at dinner, and keep a ledger in your head of favors and slights. That ledger may be your lifesaver. Now that you've seen how the public roar and private machinery collide, the retouched portraits, the medicalized silencing, the arsenic rumor's next scene will pull the curtain back even further. We go deep into the palace's private punishments, the basements that hold secrets, the exile letters, and the slow unmaking of rivals. You'll feel the chill of staircases leading down, not up. The private punishments, basements, exile letters, and the slow unmaking of rivals. Damp stone, the scrape of a key in an old lock, a distant drip, a soft, embarrassed cough as someone straightens their collar. You are led down a staircase that smells of mold, old ink, and something metallic, like coins kept too long in a pocket. The air is colder here. It presses at your lungs. The walls sweat with condensation. At the bottom, a narrow hallway of doors with brass nameplates scuffed smooth by hands that hid their shame. Behind one of those doors is a room full of boxes, ledgers tied with string, and a single table lit by a swinging lamp. This is the palace's working memory, and its surgical suite for other people's lives. On the table is an envelope stamped with the palace crest. The paper is thick and official. You break the seal and read, "By order of Her Majesty, His Excellency is appointed to the governorship of St. Walden's Isle. Departure to be arranged forthwith." It is polite. It is final. To the recipient it reads like promotion. To the courtier who knows how things work, it reads like exile. For centuries, empires have solved inconvenient people by shipping them far away, by appointment or by sentence, so they no longer loom in local politics. Sending someone overseas can be as simple as an official letter. The practice of transportation and colonial postings as a way to remove or neutralize people is part of modern imperial practice. Beside the exile letter, there is another document, a physician's note recommending the rest cure for a nervous condition. In another time, the note would be private medical care. Here it reads like a judicial sentence. In the 19th century, diagnoses like hysteria and prescriptions like the rest cure were routinely used to take women out of public life, often with terrible effects. Declaring someone ill quietly removes them from the stage without spectacle. It is humane-sounding and socially acceptable, which makes it achingly effective as a political tool. You sort through more papers. A warrant to a favored supplier, a tax audit notice stamped urgent, a contract transfer letter in which a rival's factory loses its supply. None of these are dramatic in isolation. They are administrative. They smell of ink and office hours. But stacked one on top of the other, they form a pattern. Isolation by paperwork. The slow unmaking of a rival rarely looks like a trial. It looks like bureaucracy. It is efficient, plausible, and leaves little visible trace. The person is not hanged. They are slowly made irrelevant. This is the cruelty whose fingerprints are clean. There's a smaller drawer where the palace keeps arrangements. Inside are lists, names circled in pencil, sums paid for security, travel itineraries arranged for inconvenient family members. A scrawled note reads, "Ensure the minister's ledger is audited. Start with 5 suppliers. Delay payments." A clerk's tiny cruelty becomes a ruinous cascade. When you live in a system that can turn accounting into exile, you learn to fear the little things: a delayed invoice, a withheld permit, a necessary health recommendation. These are not accidents. They are the instruments of a ruler who prefers the economy of quiet danger. Then the basement. A narrow, windowless room with quilts stacked like coffins, and trunks containing things that are inconvenient to remember. Portraits painted over, letters redacted with heavy black strokes, a few diaries with torn-out pages. Some of the palace's erasures are physical, paint scraped and reworked over a face so the next generation cannot recognize it. Other erasures are administrative, files moved to private stacks, correspondence stamped confidential, and then shelved into rooms no one will open for decades. Governments and institutions have long rearranged, hidden, or destroyed records when doing so protects reputation or power. Sometimes the erasure is crude, sometimes it's an act of plausible administration. Either way, memory is edited. Listen to the small sounds of the process. A clerk closing a ledger with a thud. A secretary folding a letter into a neat square that will never be mailed. An administrator setting a file aside and whispering, "Hold until next fiscal year." Every act of delay is an act of forgetting, and forgetting is sticky. A generation grows up with pages missing, school books that call a decade a transition, and family histories that omit a name. The slow erasure is less cinematic than a public trial, but it's far more enduring. There are the human trade-offs recorded nowhere. A mother paid to keep quiet, a gardener reassigned with a pension, a childhood friend recommended to emigrate. These are small mercies used to soften sacrifices, but they are also leverage. The palace buys silence with houses and appointments. The price is usually dignity. You move from the boxes to a locked chest of photographs. A curator has retouched negatives, cheeks softened, a suspicious hand removed. The next edition of the gallery catalogue will show a different woman. Art conservators and archivists are not neutral when politics calls. Restoration can be editing, and editing can be erasure. In essence, the public face is being rewritten one varnish stroke at a time. Pause here. This is a practical lesson for handling humans in any hierarchy. Watch where the records live and who touches them. Ask yourself, who has the power to refile your file? Who can reroute your payments? When systems can be weaponized through paperwork, your safety may depend less on strength and more on visibility and record keeping. Keep your copies. Keep receipts. If you want to survive a palace or a workplace, document everything that matters. If you found one secret file that could topple power, would you leak it, keep it, or burn it? Tell me below. I'm reading. Now that you've seen the back rooms where careers are dismantled in ink and patience, where exile can be an envelope and erasure a varnish, our next scene widens again. Will be the cover-up. How the monarchy and allied institutions rewrite the public record, retouch portraits, and create a tidy narrative that suits them.
We'll step outside the palace to the galleries and the textbooks, and watch how a whole generation comes to forget what once was. The cover-up, how a reign gets retold.
The soft scrape of a conservator's brush. A page slid into an archival folder. Distant church bells struck out of tune. You stand in a long room of frames. The walls look like a family line arranged to say one thing: continuity, dignity, normalcy. Portrait after portrait stares back, faces varnished into sameness. But when you step close, you see the seams, a cheek that doesn't match a jaw, a background painted over with fresh varnish, a cuff that used to hold a different hand. Somebody took a brush to memory and repainted the story. Museums and restorers undo and redo. Overpainting and retouching are normal parts of artwork care, but they can also be the easiest way to make someone harder to recognize. The work that flatters a nation's narrative can also erase inconvenient people. Walk farther, and the light changes. You're in a photographic archive. 19th century studios built illusions the way modern influencers use filters. Prints were retouched, negatives scratched, exposures combined. Photographers smoothed skin, removed blemishes, even pieced together separate images to make a new truth. When a public figure needs to be made smaller or larger or simply less memorable, images are a fast, quiet tool. Replace a face in a gallery, reprint an engraving with a softer mouth. Let a photograph go out of circulation, and you've already started a forgetting. Now move to the shelves. Paper boxes, ledgers, minutes. Archives don't simply record events, people decide what to keep and what to file away. Historians have a name for this. Power shapes the production of history itself. Silences are created long before scholars ever arrive to read the stacks. If a ministry decides a set of letters is confidential, if a donor funds a reorganization that moves boxes to a private room, the public record can be thinned with perfect administrative civility. Erasure is bureaucratic, not cinematic. It happens with stamps, seals, and polite notes. That's how whole decades turn into a period of transition in schoolbooks. The technical work is paired with narrative work. Newspapers and pamphlets that once printed her smiles now print cartoons. Editors commission new engravings. Gallery catalogues are revised with milder captions. Even museums sometimes conserve by overpainting their interventions. Restorers call some of this necessary. Others call it rewriting. When officials and cultural institutions coordinate, intentionally or not, to favor one version of the past, the edited archive becomes the authoritative archive. Memory is not only what happened, it is what remains affordable to say aloud. There are lower, dirtier tools as well. Portraits can be repainted to remove jewelry or a family member. Plates can be destroyed. Photographic negatives go missing. In offices, the tactics are quieter. Correspondence is transferred to a private vault. Minutes are stamped personal. Budgets are rerouted so historians later see no paper trail. Small decisions, who gets permission to copy a file, can consult the roll of microfilm, become gates. When the gates close, the story outside begins to harden in a single direction, and nuance bleeds out. All this image and print were exploding. The 19th century press could make a queen overnight and unmake her the next week. The same circulation boom that amplified her charity also amplified rumors. Reprints, engravings, and cheap prints meant that chosen images spread wide. So chosen images could also be withdrawn, revised, or replaced. The machinery of popular print and of conservation together create a second kind of sovereignty, the sovereignty of memory. A concrete smell enters the scene. Old paper, lamp smoke, and a faint chemical tang. That tang can be literal as well as symbolic. Archive boxes once stored wallpaper samples, paint chips, and household receipts. In a very century that saw this campaign of image editing, Bright green pigments like Sheely's green, arsenic-based dyes, were common in paper and decor, and caused real sickness. The same century that taught elites how to alter images and records also produced physical hazards that fed rumor. A mysterious illness could be plausibly explained as both environmental and political. People who wanted to build a story of danger found it easy to stitch together a plausible cause. There is an emotional economy to the cover-up. For the palace and its allies, editing memory is a self-defense. Protect the institution, prevent panic, secure revenue streams, and preserve alliances. For families and communities, the same edits can be a wound. Relatives cut out of genealogies, local benefactors erased from the civic record, school essays that repeat a tidy sentence about unnecessary reorganization. At the human level, reparations do not follow the erasure. The dead and the displaced rarely get their pages back. The erasure makes loneliness bureaucratic and durable. If someone quietly erased your name from a family album, what would you do? Leak it, sue it, or shout it? Comment below, I read these. Now that the public record has been tidied and painted, the palace itself grows quieter. The galleries breathe differently. The staff walk more carefully. Portraits hang a little higher, as if to keep their distance. The next scene pulls you back inside the walls to hear the silence. Servants who stop humming, a chapel emptied, and a rumor about rats that left the cellar. We move to scene. Fear in the walls, when even the rats leave. A single slow drip in a stone drain, the soft scuff of a slipper on flagstone, a distant child's laugh swallowed by a closing door. You learn to measure fear by sound. At first it's tiny, a kettle not whistling, a maid's humming cut mid-note, the chapel choir missing a voice. Then it gets bigger. Footsteps that stop at the palace threshold, gardeners who turn their backs to the yard, a market stall that no longer lists the Queen's name among its patrons. The palace breathes differently now, shallow, cautious, the way someone holds their breath when they pass a closed window. The moral pivot, when protection curdles into predation. A chair scraping, a soft, impatient cough, wind against stained glass, like a page being turned with a scabbed finger. You are standing in the council chamber the night the air changes. The candles are low. The map on the table is swollen with oil, stains from too many bowls of stew and too many spilled inks. Men and women sit with paper folded into polite armor. Outside, through the tall windows, you can hear the harbor foghorn mutter like a tired throat. Inside, the conversation is clinical. Reports, numbers, complaints. It reads like governance. And then it stops being governance. She has just returned from the northern border. Reports of bandits, of a food convoy attacked, of a town burned by marauders who might have been paid by rival merchants. The people who bring bad news bring solutions to cordons, martial patrols, lists of suspects. The ministers argue timorously. Treaties must be respected. Merchants frightened will withdraw investments. London is watching. The Queen's jaw tightens. You see it close like a trap. For a long time she has governed by shaping incentives and rearranging paperwork. Tonight she chooses a new instrument. It begins innocently, in the language of protection. We must secure the realm, she says. We must act quickly. She signs an order. No pageantry, no debate, authorizing a series of temporary measures. At first they are minor. Checkpoints, restricted trade licenses, a curfew in border villages. But the next item on the order reads differently. It's terse, bureaucratic, polite. For the safety of the public, certain persons shall be removed to avoid contagion of sedition. The words are leaves, but the roots are different. Remove means exile. Contagion means guilt by proximity. You watch how language becomes a blade. That same night, small detachments, men you have seen in the guardroom, sober, efficient, move through the town. They do not shout. They produce letters, official writs, stamped, signed. A seamstress, a schoolmaster, an alderman, taken quietly, allowed to collect a few things for travel, told to prepare for a posting. Their families pack in stunned silence. The children do not cry. They have learned how to fold sorrow into small pockets. The cat in the yard watches with an uncomprehending gaze. There is a secret meeting later, in which a frightened minister asks if they have considered that some of the removals might be seen as cruelty. The Queen's answer is bare. The realm must be ahead of the story. Better that one family be displaced than the whole town starve under a blockade. Better that one voice be muffled than the rumor spread. Her voice is calm. That is what is most terrifying. The cold efficiency of a mind that has rationalized harm into policy. What was protection, speedy, brutal, unpleasant, passes the point where it is proportionate. Now the darker textures come into play. Those removed sometimes do not reach distant postings. A carriage breaks down en route, and there is no record after the river crossing. A ship's manifest lists a name, and then that name disappears. The palace reports illness or ill-advised travel. You begin to feel that the machinery no longer spares the innocent. The line between necessary defense and conscious cruelty is crossed the moment you sanction secrecy as a standard. The polity that once accepted administrative exile as an unpleasant necessity now begins to use the same channels for elimination. There are moments that crystallize the change. Small, human, unspectacular. A minister who once argued for restrained measures finds his ledger audited until creditors seize his property. He is forced to accept a post in a colony with notoriously short winters. Another, who tries to publish an investigative pamphlet, wakes to find his printer fined for seditious material. The presses that once amplified the Queen's good deeds are now muzzled by licenses and fines. You see the architecture of predation, law, bureaucracy, and the press repurposed into instruments for silencing dissent. Inside the Queen, you detect a subtle inward hardening. The grief that once pushed her toward rituals and counseling has curdled into a strategy: prevent loss at all costs. The vocabulary of saving becomes the vocabulary of control. She begins to see threats everywhere. The wrong look in a servant's face, the wrong handshake at a banquet. Those small slights are converted into dossiers. A smile that endured into the morning now appears in a ledger entry as suspicious behavior. She starts to collect evidence as a hunter collects trophies. The difference is that trophies in this court become people's lives. There is a scene you will not forget. A young aide, loyal and naive, confesses he leaked a memo to a friend in Parliament. He thought transparency would help. The Queen listens, head slightly bowed. She reaches forward and takes his hand. She tells him, softly, that ideals are luxuries in times of threat. He is not arrested. Instead, he is given a safety posting abroad, with a handshake and a payout. He leaves with a smile that won't reach his eyes. That's the moment cruelty becomes normalized, when the punishment wears the face of benevolence. What changes the court's moral calculus is not sudden bloodshed, but 1,000 small rationales repeated until they become faith. We are protecting children. We are preserving the nation. We are preventing collapse. The motto becomes a shield against conscience. Papers are stamped, lawyers draft memos, ministers sign and sleep. Later they will tell themselves they did it for the greater good. You, watching, learn how to recognize the moral pivot in any organization. The signs are ordinary. Escalation without evidence. Secrecy justified as speed. Officials rewarded for obedience, not for judgment. And dissent labeled as disloyalty. When systems reward silence and punish questioners, you do not have debates.
You have a managed atmosphere of fear and efficiency. And there is greed entangled in the moral language. Those with means exploit measures for private gain. Contracts shifted to friends, confiscated goods funneled to allies, harbours cleared for preferred merchants. The Queen may have intended to protect the realm. The realm's predators find her protection convenient. Policy and profit braid together until the population's suffering becomes an economic externality. By then, the rituals, the candles, the mirrors, the midnight councils no longer function as tests of faith or theatre of counsel. They are instruments in a bureaucracy of guilt. Confessions obtained in the dark become paperwork in mourning. The spiritual language once used to steady a frightened sovereign is now part of the ledger that justifies removal. The metaphysical and the administrative clasp hands. The result is a regime that feels ordained and inevitable. Pause and ask yourself, where would you draw the line? If you were offered the choice, stop one famine by quietly removing a political rival, or allow the market to decide, what would you do? Drop it below, # drawn, or # no compromise. I read every answer. Now that the pivot has happened, protection hardened to predation. Next scene will show the fallout hitting the streets and the hearths. Ghost stories begin to circulate. Children dare one another to say her name in mirrors, and the whisper net tightens into myth. We'll watch how the people cope, fear, adaptation, and the strange ways communities keep memory alive, even when institutions erase it. The aftermath on the streets, ghost stories, mirrors, and memory that won't stay buried. A distant foghorn bass, the papery flutter of broadsheets, a child's laugh swallowed by a cough. You step out from under the palace shadow into a city that has learned to speak in two voices, the public voice that repeats official bulletins, and the rumor voice that trades the real news like contraband. The corner where the newsboys used to shout now tastes of wet ink and stale bread. Boys shove different sheets into your hands, some with prayers, some with pictures of a woman whose eyes the engraver has made too sharp. People read them in doorways, clutching them as if knowing the image might bite. The city's imagination turns on her like a slow storm. Ghost stories bloom first in market squares. Say her name in the mirror 3 times and you'll see the candles. Children dare each other on rainy afternoons. Carpenters carve a satire into the underside of a bench. An old woman whose apron still smells of lemon quietly hums a hymn that mentions a school whose founder is no longer named in public notices. The rumors don't need proof. They only need repetition. The age loves the supernatural, and the press loves a good supernatural angle. And the two feed one another. Seances and spirit talk were widespread enough in the 19th century that invoking them in a scoop felt plausible, not fringe. Listen for how stories change when they leave the palace. A private ritual becomes an orgy of midnight witchcraft in print. A careful policy memo becomes a decree from a madwoman. Newspapers and illustrated weeklies in this era had huge reach and were built to sell emotion as much as facts. An engraving or a repeated editorial can turn private fear into public certainty faster than any official statement can fix it. The press didn't just report the scandal. It amplified and reshaped it into a folklore that belonged to everyone, and therefore, paradoxically, to no one. Sensory details anchor the rumor. A boy's hands black with ink from the press. The metallic tang in the mouth when you read the paper under a street lamp. The hush that falls when two strangers realize they share the same whisper. The smell of the city itself, coal smoke, wet leather, the faint chemical tang of industrial dyes, becomes part of the tale. People point at an old green wallpaper in a second-story tenement and say it sings at night, because arsenic-based greens, Sheely's green similar pigments, were real, and their toxic reputation fed the public's appetite for explanation when illness struck. Those material facts, poisonous pigments really existed, made supernatural-sounding accusations easier to believe.
There are other, quieter consequences that the rumor machine can't fully erase. In the alleys and parlors there are small acts of memory. A seamstress who keeps the name of a patron in the hem of a daughter's apron. A school teacher who whispers a donor's story to a favored pupil. An old cook who remembers a silver coin handed out in troubling times. These are the human archives, oral histories that survive because someone refuses to let a name die quietly. They are fragile and slow, but they are stubborn. Where institutions paint over portraits, people keep their memories in recipes and lullabies. Those private recollections are how communities resist official forgetting. The fear dynamic changes behavior. Markets adapt. Some stalls no longer accept certain tradesmen's goods. Patrons cease to ask a particular family to cater events. Festivals shift dates to avoid controversial anniversaries. Social life learns the art of omission. The same techniques used in the palace to erase reputations are imitated by ordinary people to avoid risk. Human memory is pragmatic. If saying a name brings trouble, families learn to tuck it away. That practical amnesia becomes communal policy without an ordinance, self-censorship as a survival technique. But rumor is both a weapon and a balm. It protects some. By redirecting blame onto specters, it shields communities from looking at the systems that dispossess them, and it punishes others by turning them into legends. The Queen becomes a story people can tell about darkness and power, and stories are sticky. They pass from mouth to mouth long after any official bulletin is folded away. Quick practical survival note. You asked for tips on handling humans. If you live where a rumor economy rules, your best currency is small, verifiable records, receipts, letters, names written and duplicated. Oral memory matters, but paper spreads. Keep duplicates in different hands. If something in public looks like folklore, ask, who benefits if this becomes the truth? Often that question tells you more than the rumor itself. Have you ever seen a rumor become history? Tell me where you were when it happened. I'll read a few. A bell rings once, the sound of a kettle being put on. A child daring another to say the Queen's name into a dark window. Now that the streets have learned to speak in rumors and the people keep quiet memories in their aprons and hymn books, I will push outward from folklore back to meaning. We'll ask, what does her ghost teach us today about memory, power, and how communities either collude in erasure or protect the names they care about? We'll also look at the unexpected ways people preserved scraps of truth, attic letters, odd ledgers, and a single portrait hidden in a provincial church, and how those scraps can be used to retell a life. What her ghost teaches us. Memory, power, and the small things that save truth. The hush of an attic. Wind over slate roofs. A single page turned very slowly. You stand in the half-light of an attic, where dust smells like old ink, and the sun falls through a crack that looks like a wound. The city below goes on with its business, food, gossip, the regular transactions of survival. But up here, time has a different rhythm. This is where memory survives. Not in the tidy, curated rooms of museums, but in trunks, in a hymn scribbled in the margin of a prayer book, in a ledger someone hid behind a loose board because they were afraid to file it where officials could find it. Her ghost is not a spectre that rattles chains. Her ghost is a ledger entry, a burnt photograph, a lullaby the cook still hums. Those fragments teach you 3 blunt lessons about power and people. 1. Power edits itself. People smuggle truth. Institutions repainted faces and stamped boxes confidential. That's how big erasures become official. But people, gardeners, seamstresses, retired clerks, smuggle truth in small things. A retold story at supper, a name stitched into an apron, a Xerox put in a shoebox and mailed to a nephew abroad. Those micro-archives become the scaffolding for future recovery. If you want memory to survive, don't rely on a single vault. Duplicate the truth in voices and copies. 2. Material facts give rumors traction. In the era we're in, small, technical things made stories believable. People really practiced spiritualism and seances. Table tipping and mediums were common enough to be mainstream entertainment and private consolation for the bereaved. That cultural reality let an accusation about spirit counsel feel plausible to a public already hungry for supernatural explanation. Likewise, real hazards, like arsenic-based greens used in wallpaper and dyes, were common enough that a whispered, "She poisoned them with wallpaper," could find a listening ear and a plausible mechanism. The existence of material facts like poisonous pigments gave rumor the oxygen it needed. 3. Systems weaponize care. Medical language, hysteria, the rest cure, was not just medicine. It was a social tool in the 19th century that could remove a woman from public life under the auspices of compassion. Those therapeutic measures could be repurposed to manage dissent. That pattern shows how a culture's solutions become its instruments for control. Walk the attic shelves with me, and you'll see how those fragments collect. A bundle of carbon copies of letters the palace thought destroyed. Ink smudged, signatures you can almost read if you hold them to the light. A photograph with a hand brushed out, the negative cut and taped. Someone's quiet censorship made visible if you know to look. A hymn book with a page removed, the edges browned as if from fire, or from hands trying to hide a single verse praising a queen who is no longer in the public chronicle. These are tactile proofs that erasure is always improvisational. Institutions can reorganize archives and repaint portraits, but they cannot as easily erase the human habit of preserving what matters. Oral testimony, grandmother's stories, apprentices' recollections, a cook's list of donations, becomes a moral archive. You can digitize it, record it, and distribute it. If you want a name to survive, land it in multiple media, voice, paper, and digital copies distributed to different custodians. A few practical battle-tested ways people actually preserve truth in hostile environments, and you can use these now. Duplicate widely. Put copies in different physical locations and different formats. An attic copy, a trusted friend abroad, and an encrypted digital backup make erasure expensive. Create distributed witnesses. Train 3 people to tell the same story exactly the same way. When institutions try to gaslight memory, consistent witnesses make denial harder. Use mundane channels. Put the hard truth inside a recipe, a hymn, or a children's rhyme. Bury facts in everyday things. Editors and curators less often comb through grandma's stew recipe. Leverage small legal steps. Deposit a notarized copy with a neutral university or an overseas archive. Institutional custody is harder to tamper with when multiple jurisdictions hold copies. Go vocal, smartly. Publish selected letters or proofs in a small-run pamphlet or on a website that mirrors the content across multiple hosts. Noise can be protection. Now an honest account. Memory projects can feel small and petty next to the institutions that erase, but they're effective. The people who recovered erased histories decades later often started with an attic box, a retold anecdote, a travel-worn ledger. In many cases, academic books, museum exhibitions, legal inquiries, those tiny fragments were the hinge that reopened a story. If a story can be reassembled from crumbs, it can be argued back into the record. A couple of the heavy-handed structural facts that made this queen's erasure possible were not accidental. The era's illustrated press and mass broadsheets created instant celebrity and instant scandal, so a smear could spread fast and stick. Newspapers and illustrated weeklies, like the Illustrated London News, were not neutral conveyors of facts. They were commercial engines that amplified spectacle and shaped reputations at scale. That media ecology made reputational attacks efficient.
and the Imperial toolkit made removal feasible. Sending inconvenient people away, or engineering postings in distant colonies, was an established method for neutralizing rivals. Transportation and overseas postings had long histories as tools of punishment and political management, so exile was both possible and plausible as a solution. That logistical reality made quiet erasure a bureaucratic option. If you found one sealed box in an attic with letters inside, would you #publish now, #archive safely, or #share with family? Vote below. I'm reading. A child in the street dares another to say a name into a mirror. The mirror fogs a little and looks like a mouth. Before we move on, this matters for how you handle people. In any system that rewards silence and punishes questioners, the human currency is trust and documented proof. If you want to survive and protect others, work on networks of trust, 3 deep, geographically separated, and keep the receipts. People with power will always try to centralize archives and narratives, decentralize memory, and you make erasure costly. Now that you've learned how memory survives in trunks and songs, and how material facts and media made erasure believable, next scene will turn inward to the palace's remaining haunt. How locals begin to see her at windows, the markets remember her small kindnesses, and the ghostly stories harden into a folk legacy that refuses to die. We'll step back into the corridors where pearls sometimes glint in the dark, and ask whether the quiet acts of remembrance, those recipes and hymns, could ever restore a name in stone. The haunting that refuses to die, how folk memory keeps her alive. A church bell thrumming 3 soft notes, a wooden stall lid thumped closed, the distant scrape of a wheel on cobbles. You walk the old quarter at dusk, lantern light puddles on wet cobbles, and the smells fold into one another. Coal soot, stale ale, the tart perfume of a baker's lemon tarts. The palace is a dark block on the skyline, but the life around it hums in smaller frequencies. Here is where her name refuses the tidy erasure of archives and glossy curators. Here, memory is tenacious and inconvenient. Start at the barrow by the fishmonger. He's a man with a face like a salted map. His hands are permanently scored from knives. When business is slow, he slips you a paper-wrapped herring, and if you get the right look, he'll tell you in a whisper about the day she walked through the rain and handed him a handful of sovereigns because his boy was sick. He still keeps that coin in a shoebox under his stall. No museum plaque, no headline, just a metal memory that keeps a story honest. The coin smells faintly of vinegar and of pocketed hope. That's the currency of folk memory, not official, but real. Move 2 streets over and you find the seamstress, an old woman with needles like small accusations. Her apron has a hidden pocket where she has sewn a yellowed letter. She takes it out, and with the slow reverence of someone handling a relic, smooths the crease. It's a receipt for donations to a school, written in a hand that once signed with a flourish, now gone from public records. She hums the song the Queen once had sung aloud at that school's opening. She teaches it to a child who tugs at her sleeve. The melody is not in any archive, only in the seamstress's throat and in the child's humming. That borrowed tune is a small rebellion, memory transmitted by voice rather than authority. Look at the bricklayer who works on the city wall. He's a quiet man who carries 2 small things in his satchel: a tattered hymn book with 1 missing page, and a scrap of map passed down by his grandfather showing where a village well was rebuilt with royal funds. He will not speak the Queen's name loudly in market squares. He learned discretion. But late at the inn, by lamplight and ale, he will point to a place on the map and say, "She once stopped the taxes here." People there nod. They add their own fragments. How their grandfather got a contract. How a neighbor's shop was spared rent for a season. The story reconstructs itself, piece by piece in low voices.
Ghost stories blossom, yes, but they are not all mockery. The mirror game, say her name 3 times and she appears, is performed by children daring one another, but older people use it differently. An elderly midwife will lift a looking glass and tell a nursing mother to whisper the Queen's name before a difficult birth. The midwife says it keeps the household safe, an invocation that mixes superstition and gratitude. The mirror, once a prop for silly dares, becomes a protective ritual in kitchens where people have learned to make belief work for them. There are rituals of culinary memory too. The cook who once worked in the palace keeps a recipe, the exact proportions for a lemon tart that was always served after a royal school visit. She measures not with cups, but with memory. 2 pinches of sugar when the bells first ring. She bakes that tart on certain anniversaries and leaves a slice on a windowsill for the forgotten. People stop by, take a bite, and remember the small kindnesses the textbooks forgot to list. Food becomes a ledger. Taste is testimony. You'll find a shrine of sorts. 3 cracked tiles by a churchyard wall where locals leave pennies and sprigs of rosemary. No official signpost, no municipal plaque, just tokens and an old hand-scrawled scrap that reads, "For the ones who fed us." Pilgrims, schoolteachers, a retired clerk, an aunt who remembers a cooked coin, come in secret and lay their small offerings. This private liturgy is how communities keep truth alive when institutions choose to forget. Not all memory is reverent. There's revenge in rumor too. Stories twisted to punish the powerful by making them grotesque. Caricatures sketched in alehouses show her crowned with thorns or whispering to candled bowls. But even grotesque memory preserves a kernel. The public remembers her as an active figure, not an absence. The form degrades, but the subject remains. Paradoxically, slander and legend both anchor her to the present. There are practical artifacts of resistance. An attic chest with a bundle of letters hidden under a false bottom. A schoolmaster's copy of minutes with penciled notes in the margins that mention a grant from the Crown. No name attached. A midwife's ledger with a donation recorded in shorthand only an old relative can read. These objects are small but stubborn seeds of truth. They are often scattered, kept by laundry women, carpenters, retired clerks, so that to erase them would require a coordinated sweep through thousands of hands, a task too big for the palace and too messy for donors. That dispersal is survival by diffusion. The city's festivals adapt. Where once a grand procession carried portraits in gilded frames, now the market's children perform a play that, under the guise of old tales, places her again at the moral center, sometimes as hero, sometimes as cautionary figure. The play is crude, improvised, but effective. Audiences laugh, then pause. A child in the front row asks her grandmother, "Who was she?" And the grandmother, whose hands tremble making a mending stitch, tells one concise story. The version that keeps the family's dignity intact. Here's a practical human handling skill that comes from watching this. If you want to protect a truth in an environment that erases, distribute it like a secret recipe. Put pieces of the story in many ordinary homes. A line in a hymn, a recipe, a carved bench, a garden stone. When truth is ordinary, it is hard to purge. When truth is only in one vault, it dies with the key holder. When it's in many hands, it survives administrative tidyovers. There are also betrayals. A village that accepted a new donor's money found their local plaque rewritten, their monument repurposed. Someone took a photograph of a retouched portrait and posted it. Comments argued over who should be remembered. Memory is a battleground. Sometimes communities compromise comfort for a new library or a paved road. That trade-off is messy and human. People will choose warmth and work over the discomfort of remembering a controversial past. That's why small pockets of resistance matter. They keep the ember alive long enough for curiosity or courage to fan it into flame.
Sensory detail. At night, the air here tastes of coal and rosemary. You can smell lemon tart 15 paces away and hear the clack of a needle. The tactile truth, the weight of an old coin, the grain of a wooden bench, anchors memory. Those physical sensations make abstract history feel like a hand on your shoulder. Ever had a family story that no one else believes? Share it below. I'll read a few tonight. A child singing the old school hymn softly. The sound grows and fades. Now that the streets and stalls and attics have kept her name flickering, sometimes as gratitude, sometimes as caution, sometimes as mockery, we move to the most interesting part. I will close the tale. A reflective, challenging conclusion that asks what we owe history and how we handle humans in positions of power. We'll leave the palace and look at our own mirrors. What stories do we edit, and who do we let vanish? Mirror and the lesson. What we owe history, and how to handle humans who hold power. A slow turning of a heavy key, wind over the palace roof, a single long note of a cello. You stand in front of a mirror in the throne room one last time. The glass is old and slightly warped. When you look in, you don't just see your face. You see what stories were allowed to live, and which ones were sanded down until only polite shapes remain. The crown beside the mirror is heavy, warm from use, and it leaves an imprint on the velvet, a dent like a habit. That dent is our closing image. Power leaves marks, and then people decide whether those marks will be taught as trophies or hidden under carpet. This final scene asks one blunt question. What do we owe the erased? Not miracles, not full restitution of every name and ledger, but the basic things a human life deserves. A visible record, a fair account, and the chance for communities to choose whether to judge or forgive. History is not only for the victors, it's for people whose names were tucked into pockets and shoeboxes, so the state could breathe easier. The practice of hiding inconvenient facts from retouched portraits to confidential boxes in archives is real and very practical. Institutions have long shaped which stories survive and which remain footnotes.
Think about the tools that made her erasure possible, because understanding the tools tells you how to block them next time. In the 19th century, a culture of seance and mediumship made private ritual plausible as political theatre. The public already believed in communication with the dead, so a ruler using spirits could turn that cultural grammar into authority or scandal, depending on who told the story. That cultural context amplified rumor into credibility. Material facts mattered too. Bright, glorious pigments like Sheely's green really existed and really made people sick in houses painted with them. So the claim, "she poisoned with wallpaper," could find a plausible mechanism in the public imagination. Understanding that these are not just metaphors, that paint and paper were sometimes poisonous, helps you see why some accusations stuck so fast. Medical language was another tool. When the culture accepted diagnoses like hysteria and therapies like the rest cure, it created a soft, socially acceptable channel to remove women from public life. Labels that sound sympathetic can function as instruments of erasure. That is a lesson about how care language can be weaponized. And the press cheap illustrated periodicals and weeklies that circulated pictures and editorial tone widely taught the public to trust a single image or an engraving as proof. Visuals and repetition made reputations and destroyed them fast. In short, culture, chemistry, medicine, and media braided together to make the erasure efficient. What to do: practical survival skills for handling people in power and protecting truth. I promised you practical takeaways on how to handle humans. Here they are. Palace tested and usable anywhere. 1. Duplicate everything that matters. 2 physical copies, 1 digital, stored in different places and if possible with different custodians.
The more copies, the harder the eraser. 2. Keep 2 ledgers. One public, what you'll say in polite rooms. One private, dates, names, receipts, exact wording. The private ledger is insurance. 3. Build a 3-deep network. Have 3 trusted persons in different places who know the same core facts. Distributed witnesses beat centralized erasure. 4. Watch microsignals. The tiny things reveal the big moves. A delayed invitation, an omitted name, who sits closest at a banquet. They're the grammar of control. 5. Don't let care language disarm you. If a policy is framed as protection, ask for specifics and paper trails. Compassion can be a legal wrapper. 6. Document the theater. If people stage rituals, ceremonies, or consultations, document who attended when and what the public claims were later. The theater becomes evidence when paired with records. 7. Donate copies to neutral places. University libraries, overseas repositories, and community archives are harder to influence quickly than a single palace archive. 8. Create ordinary memory. Hide facts inside recipes, songs, and small community rituals. When truth is ordinary and distributed, it survives censorship better than when it's elite and centralized. These are not glamorous. They're boring, slow, and administrative. That's the point. Boring beats bonfires. The Queen's erasure succeeded because people relied on centralized, respectable systems, archives, print media, curators. We can blunt that by using the opposite: distributed, ordinary, and persistent methods. A candid challenge, what we must ask ourselves. If you walk away from this video with one uneasy question, make it this: which stories am I complicit in editing right now? Do we let fundraising dollars decide which monuments stand? Do convenience and comfort let communities accept tidy histories in place of messy truth? When someone in power is accused, do we demand due process, or do we only buy the version that confirms our bias? We live in a world with different technologies, but similar mechanics. Social media can amplify or erase reputations in hours. Institutional archives still decide what researchers see. Curated narratives still teach children. The lessons from the palace are not only about a forgotten Victorian queen, they are about the human choices that make forgetting easy. If you'd like, I can make a short checklist/template you can use to start a community memory project. Say the word, and I'll draft it. You've walked the palace, smelled coal and lemon, listened to candle rites, seen ledgers, and retouched portraits. You felt how a person might change from beloved to monster, depending on who holds the pen and who retouches the photo. That's the reversible part of history. Once you know tools used to hide, you can unpick them. History is not only what happened, it's what survives the cut. Be suspicious of neat narratives. Keep records. Trust small people with big memories. Protect the messy archive's attic boxes, hymn books, seamstresses' pockets, because they hold what institutions might tidy away. And finally, be kinder to the ambiguous figures in the past. People who make hard choices often do harm and good in the same breath. Our job is not to demonize reflexively, but to document honestly. If this story stuck with you, do one small thing: share it. Tell one person this week about an erased name in your own family or community. Make a copy of an old letter. Those tiny acts bend history back toward the human. If you like this deep dive and want more hidden histories told like movies, smash that like button, subscribe for more episodes, and tell me in the comments which erased figure should I hunt down next. I read every suggestion. A candle snuffs slowly. An old hymn is hummed under the credits. Sources for the historical facts referenced in this scene for further reading. On Victorian spiritualism and seances. On arsenic pigments, Sheely's green, and real poisoning concerns. On hysteria,
and the 19th century rest cure, on the power of illustrated weeklies and mass circulation press in shaping reputations, on archival silence and how power shapes what archives keep or story, deeper and tighter, with the real mechanics behind the myth. You came in with a scratched-out headline and a candle. Now we're stepping back from every scene, from that first clipped scrap to the final mirror, and pulling the threads together, so the picture isn't just spooky, it's explainable. I'll move through scenes 120 in order, fold the evidence into the drama, and finish with the concrete takeaways and a call to action. This is long and careful because the story you asked for isn't just a ghost story. It's a lesson about how power, culture, and paperwork can make someone vanish. The arc in one sweep, the setup and the tools. First, opens on the scratched headline, "The story you didn't know was missing." That cut is literal and symbolic. Once someone with resources decides a chapter is inconvenient, the eraser begins. From we're inside the palace, the slow, sensory world of marble and coal smoke, of public spectacle and private ledger. She arrives as a charming consort, image crafted, crowds pleased, and she learns the tools that turn popularity into leverage. Photography and pageantry, patronage, carefully timed charity, and the court's secret grammar of favors. In next scene is the turning point. A banquet where someone becomes ill, servants who vanish, and the candlelit rituals that blur theatre and statecraft. Two factual things that make these scenes plausible for a Victorian setting are worth flagging now. A. Spiritualism and seances were mainstream enough in the 19th century that a ruler's private rituals could be both believable and politically useful. People expected spirit talk in certain circles. B. Technically real hazards, like arsenic-laced pigments, existed in Victorian interiors. That material reality made rumors about poisoning feel plausible to contemporaries. So, rituals can be social tests, and real-world chemistry gives gossip credibility. That's the double engine that drives the palace rumors. Rumor, press, and institutional erasure marks the monster's birth. The cheap illustrated weeklies and mass circulation press take private whispers and turn them into saleable spectacle. Visuals, engravings, woodcuts, and repetition make character assassinations fast and sticky. Illustrated weeklies like the Illustrated London News helped give a new, visual power to reputation in this exact era. We see how public spectacle and private machinery interlock. Medical language, hysteria, nervousness, and administrative moves, quiet postings, audits, health letters, are repurposed to neutralize opposition. The 19th century rest cure and the medicalization of women's political behavior made it disturbingly easy to remove a woman from the public stage under the guise of care. Then the cover-up widens, art restorers repaint, archivists refile, donors fund consolidation, and schoolbooks get a tidy paragraph where a life used to stand. This is not dramatic bonfires. It's administration. Stamps, confidential labels, retouched plates, and carefully worded curator notes. That slow institutional editing is exactly what scholars call archival silence, power shaping what survives. The fallout vanishing in everyday life, and folk memory that survives, shows the consequences in everyday spaces. School primers that skip her name, retouched portraits in municipal galleries, and attic letters that hold the only surviving truth. Is the moral pivot? Protection hardens into predation. The apparatus that began as security becomes a system for quietly removing people, exile, punitive postings, audits, and bureaucratic strangulation. Transportation, exile, and colonial postings have long been practical tools for removing inconvenient people in imperial systems. In practice,
Exile looks polite on paper and final in life.
Show the city learning to speak in two voices: official silence and rumor, grotesque caricature and small human gratitude. Folk memory, coins kept in shoeboxes, hymns sung in kitchens, recipes that hide receipts, becomes the alternate archive. Those human low-tech practices are often the only things that survive institutional tidy-up. Mirror, then lesson. What this whole story arc actually means. When you stand in the throne room mirror at the end, you aren't just seeing the Queen's face. You're seeing the mechanisms that turn someone into a headline and then into a footnote. The main, historic grounded mechanisms we've woven into the drama are these 5 load-bearing realities. I checked the scholarship and museum scholarship for each. Spiritualism and seances were mainstream enough in the Victorian era that ritual could be credible as both counsel and theatre. Arsenic-laced pigments, Sheely's green and related dyes, really existed and created a believable technical pathway for poisoning rumours. Medical labels like hysteria and treatments like the rest cure were real practices used in the 19th century and could be, and were, weaponized socially. The rise of illustrated mass circulation weeklies changed reputation making. Images and sensational copy could make or break rulers very quickly. Archival silence is not an accident. Historians show how power controls what survives by curating, redacting, and closing files. That's how eras are shortened to periods of consolidation. If you take nothing else from the story, take this. History is both what happened and what could be kept. People with power control the second half by editing, retouching, and administrating memory away. Deeper, practical lessons. How to handle humans and protect truth. Palace-tested, usable anywhere. You asked for survival skills for handling humans. Here are pivotal, concrete moves drawn from the Ark. 1. Duplicate records. 2 physical copies, 1 digital copy, stored in different custodial hands. 1 archive can be reorganized. Many scattered copies are expensive to erase. 2. Keep 2 ledgers. 1 for the public script, 1 private ledger. Dates, exact wording, witnesses. The private ledger is your evidence bank. 3. Distribute witnesses. Train 3 geographically separated people to tell the same verified story. Distributed witnesses survive institutional gaslighting. 4. Monitor microsignals. The tiny things reveal the big moves. Delayed invitations, omitted names, who sits closest at dinner. Those microsignals are the court's grammar. 5. Read care with suspicion. If a policy is framed as protection, ask for traceable paper, orders, receipts, travel manifests, because care is the favorite wrapper for administrative removal. 6. Make memory ordinary. Hide truth in recipes, hymns, children's rhymes, and community rituals. When a fact is ordinary and distributed, it's harder to purge. 7. Use third-party deposits. Deposit copies with neutral institutions, university libraries, overseas archives, so access rests in multiple jurisdictions. 8. Document theatre. When rituals or private councils happen, record attendees, dates, and public claims. Ritual theatre becomes evidence when cross-referenced with records. These are bureaucratic, small-step tactics. They're boring. Boredom is what beats a bonfire. Final reflection. Short, emotional. Who do we remember and why? The Queen in our story is ambiguous on purpose. Protector and predator, saint and monster. That ambiguity is the point. People who consolidate power often do good and harm. The public narrative that survives tends to simplify that moral mix into labels hero or villain. Our responsibility is not to assign easy labels, but to preserve messy records so future people can see the choices, limits, and context. If you want to be brave in your community, start by copying one old letter you or someone you know cares about, and give a copy to 2 different safe custodians. That small act resists erasure. If this deep conclusion hit the mark, do these 3 tiny things that actually help creators like me and get us more stories to chase. 1. Smash that like button if you want more hidden history deep dives. 2. Subscribe for more episodes where we reopen edited chapters and tell them like movies. 3. Comment below. Which erased figure should I track next, a queen, a mayor, an inventor, or a community hero? Tell me who and where. I'm reading every comment. Want that edit sheet? Thanks for sticking with this long one. You just lived 20 scenes of how history gets made, broken, and if we're clever and stubborn, recovered.